what happens when a deaf child is born? Often, at least in America, the doctor will come to the parents and say, "I'm so sorry, your child is deaf." And the doctor will say, "We've made a diagnosis. This is the situation. Your child is deaf." But there are some treatments. They might even talk about some cures. They immediately, in the United States at least, will start talking to you about a cochlear implant, about speech training. This is very typical. And this has nothing to do with reality. When a deaf baby is born, it's a healthy baby. We shouldn't rob the parents of the joy of having a healthy baby. It is not a diagnosis that your child is deaf. Your child's not sick. Your child's not going to die. It's an auditory determination of auditory status. That's all. And what does it mean to you? It means your baby needs language. It means that it won't happen automatically unless you do something about it. When a hearing baby is born, we don't think about trying to give that child language because that child is bombarded by accessible language all the time. And the child learns it automatically. They don't have to work at it. You don't have to be smart to learn language if you are bombarded by an accessible language. Likewise, if a deaf child is born into a deaf family, they don't have to worry about their child getting language. Their child is going to be bombarded by sign language. Their child is going to learn it naturally. It's not going to be a problem. But 96% of deaf babies are born into hearing families. Most of the time, these families don't know anything about what that means. They don't know anything about how to give their child language. So that's the issue. That's what doctors need to be helping the families learn how to do. Learn how to give that child language. What is language? And we all think we know what language is. And yet, when you talk to doctors, they'll talk about speech. Speech, speech, speech. Speech is a modality of language. Signing is a modality of language. Language is a cognitive faculty. It's something that takes place in your brain, and your brain can realize it in two different ways. One way is orally and aurally, speaking and hearing. One way is manually and visually, signing. They're just two different modalities, two different realizations of the same cognitive faculty. Both modalities are entirely capable of expressing everything that language needs to express. In the 1980s, in the United States, a team of two people, both of them deaf, went around to different universities to try to convince people that you could express anything in a sign language that you can express in a spoken language. And what they did was, one of them described how to do something with the manifold in your car, something having to do with the engine of your car. I don't know how to do whatever it was that they did, but it's pretty complicated. And one of them described how to do it in American Sign Language. And somebody else described the double helix of your genes, a very complex scientific construction. And she did it beautifully in American Sign Language. It was very dramatic what they did, and it really made its point. And it made its point not just in universities. They also went around to deaf clubs and deaf associations, because there were deaf people in the United States who had been taught for years that sign languages were inferior, that they were simply systems of gestures, that they did not have all the complexity of a real, true language. But in fact, they do. And that prejudice was wrong. So we push it aside, and now we move forward. Language is not speech. Language is a cognitive facility, and there's two modalities of it. How do we know that it's there in the brain? One way we know that this modality is handled, that both modalities are handled the same way by the brain, is from looking at language pathologies, looking at illnesses in language. So there's an illness called aphasia, where someone has had an injury to the brain. And aphasia is a kind of injury that has effects on your language. Sometimes it affects the sounds that you make, the articulations that you make, and sometimes it affects the meaning. You'll use a word that isn't the word that you want at all for that meaning, but you can't help it. You'll call a cat a rug or something like that. And you can't control it. And it works the same way. Aphasia on a deaf person who signs has the same effect on their signing that aphasia on a hearing person who speaks has on their speaking. It's the same part of the brain controls articulation in a sign language and articulation in a spoken language. The same part of the brain affects semantics and meaning in a sign language that affects semantics and meaning in a spoken language. So we know that it's the same faculty. Also, we know it from looking at how children learn language around the world, how they acquire it, the order in which they acquire things. Languages around the world differ a lot. Chinese is very different from Japanese, which is very different from Swahili, which is very different from Brazilian Portuguese, which is very different from Catalan. Chinese Sign Language is very different from South African Sign Language, is very different from Dutch, and the sign language of the Netherlands is very different from Catalan Sign Language. Languages differ quite a lot. And yet, two languages that seem very far apart, the children learn to use those languages in very much the same order. They will first most of the time, first learn individual words or individual signs. Then they'll start putting them together. Then they'll start, and all along they'll be playing with articulations. They'll be babbling in sign. They'll be babbling in speech. And by the time a child is around 4 or 5 years old, they're a very good user of their language, whatever language they are raised in. That has to do with human cognition. It's the way that we learn. That's very good evidence that languages are all handled by this same faculty in our brain. Now, an important thing about language that is of crucial importance to the deaf child is that our brains change over time. When we are first born, our brains are what psychologists call very, very plastic. As we age, certain plasticities lessen. So you learn huge amounts as a very small person. As you age, you can continue learning plenty of things, but it can get harder for you to learn things. And some things, it becomes impossible for you to learn. If you have a child who is cross-eyed and you do not correct that with surgery by the age of around 2 years old, that child, if you do the surgery after 2, will probably never see stereoscopically. Whereas if you do the surgery before 2, they will. There's something about our brains that changes around 2 years old with respect to our visual cognition. And we just can't manage to re-fix it after that point. We just can't do it. There are a number of abilities like that for which the brain has a plasticity that changes. Language is one of them. When it comes to sound, if we are not exposed to sound, we will have a huge amount of difficulty distinguishing different sounds if we are not exposed to them by the age of 18 months. Sound really, really needs early access. That's one of the reasons why with cochlear implants, they've pushed the age back and back and back toward implanting, because they want to get that implant in before the child reaches this kind of sensitive period or critical period, after which they're going to have much more trouble processing sound. But language, not sound, we're not making confusion anymore between language and speech. Speech and sign are both language. Language is luckier. Language has a critical period, a sensitive period, around 5 years old. If you are exposed to an accessible language before around 5 years old, you're probably going to just take to it just like that. And, you could be exposed to 2 accessible languages, 3, 4. There are places in the world where children are hearing many different languages all the time. And they're getting them because they've got this plastic brain that just absorbs it. It becomes harder and harder to acquire a first language after 5. So if a child is denied accessible language, you've really made it hard for them to ever get any language. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because often people will say, sign language is easy. Oh my God, are they wrong? Sign language is so hard. To sign well, it is so hard. But that aside, people will say that. It's easy. So let's do a cochlear implant. Let's teach the child to speak. Then, if the child fails, what a terrible, terrible word to use about a child. If the child fails at it, then later we can give them sign language. Okay, yes, you can. And children, so many deaf children do get sign language later, and they have to work at it. But the deaf community helps them because so many people have been there. You know how to help them, and you help them. But what you can't help them with is all the things that depend on a solid first language. All those things, they're going to always have trouble with. So you've put those children behind. Those children now have to play a catch-up game on everything. They have to play a catch-up game on math because you didn't give them a solid first language. They may never get theory of mind. You know, they may never be good problem solvers. And you did that to them. They had every ability sitting there waiting. But this delay was very expensive. Yeah. So the window of opportunity that we can look through, you know, it's very small. And it gets smaller. It's so hard to see through. Now, I want to talk about cochlear implants. I don't know how many people here have cochlear implants. I often talk to groups where people do have cochlear implants, where parents have chosen to give their children cochlear implants. And I do believe that whether you choose to give your child a cochlear implant or not is a personal decision. I would never want someone to make the decision for me. I would never make the decision for you. I would never try to influence you in making that decision. But I want you to understand that a cochlear implant is not a super hearing aid. A cochlear implant does not cure deafness. So, if you look here, this is cutting your head. Take the front off your face and you can see inside your head. When sound comes at you, it goes into your ear canal. Let's see. Yeah. It goes through the ear canal. It hits the eardrum, which vibrates. That causes these little bones to hit each other. That causes one of them to start vibrations in the liquid inside the cochlea, which is tubes. And that excites the auditory nerve. That's how it works, okay? That's the biology of it. A cochlear implant does not do that. A hearing aid does. A hearing aid just increases the sound. It increases the amplitude so that more, a louder sound wave is coming into your ear and hits that eardrum harder to help everything go. And it just goes the way it goes on a hearing person. But a cochlear implant doesn't. A cochlear implant, a cochlear implant, there's a receiver on the outside of your head, which is connected magnetically to something inside your head, and that receiver, it turns sound into electrical impulses. And those impulses, they do not go through the ear. They bypass the ear canal. They bypass the eardrum. They bypass the little bones. They go in a tube through the cochlea, in a wire through the cochlea. They don't start vibrations in the cochlea, and they directly excite the auditory nerve directly. So they're delivering electrical impulses to the auditory nerve. Well, that's not the way we were made to be. We are not hardwired for what the cochlear implant is delivering to the brain. We are hardwired for what the ear delivers to the brain. What that means is that you have to learn how the person who receives the cochlear implant, you have to learn how to interpret the electrical impulses that are given to your auditory nerve. Your brain has to figure out what those things mean. And you can't do it on your own. If you take a deaf child, give them a cochlear implant, and give them no training, you've given them brain surgery for no reason, because they will not learn language. It will not be accessible to them. You must train them. Okay. What does it mean to train